Today I'm going to be talking about one of the texts in the first week of the Romantic period, Mary Robinson's The Poor Singing Dame. Mary Robinson was an English actress and author, an ardent supporter of the rights of women, which she ran in the same circles as like Mary Wollstonecraft and um, the whole movement at the time for the rights of women. So, and she gained considerable fame during her lifetime. She wrote 8 novels and 14 volumes of poetry during her lifetime, and two collections of poetry were published posthumously. Her poetry is characterized by a lot of the characteristics that we've already looked at in the Romantic period, in our introduction to the Romantic period, our lecture notes that we talked about. She focused a lot of her attention on the downtrodden figures of society. And then she also had a fascination with the fantastic, which we talked about being kind of a romantic ideal, the imagination, the fantastic, maybe even a little bit of the supernatural, that kind of thing. She was part of the literary circle that included several other popular writers at the time, philosophers, William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, as I mentioned earlier, Samuel Taylor Coleridge is a writer and poet at the time period. So she was an actress. We talked about that, which you have to consider at this time. The women as an actress was just slightly above the level of prostitution, um, unfortunately. But she was famous. She did gain a lot of fame and popularity. She played Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. She was in like for 4 seasons in the theater, which kind of gave her access to high society. And then she also, during one of her stints on the stage, caught the eye of the young Prince of Wales, who would later become King George IV, which was rumored to have an affair with him. And he funded a lot of her writing and her lifestyle for a little bit. And then at the end of her life, tragically, her final months were plagued by debt and illness. And she died on December 26th of 1800. So let's take a look at the selection that I chose, which is The Poor Singing Dame. We'll read and analyze as we kind of go along here. Beneath an old wall, that went round an old castle for many a year with brown ivy o'erspread, a neat little hovel, its lowly roof raising, defied the wild winds that howled over its shed. The turrets that frowned on the poor simple dwelling were rocked to and fro when the tempest would roar, and the river, that down the rich valley was swelling, flowed swiftly beside the green step of its door. The summer gilded the rushy roof slanting, the bright dews bespangled its ivory-bound hedge, and above, on the ramparts, the sweet birds were chanting, and wild buds thick dappled the clear river's edge. When the castle's rich chambers were haunted and dreary, the poor little hovel was still and secure, and no robber e'er entered, nor goblin nor fairy, for the splendors of pride had no charms to allure. Okay, so what we have here is we have a little cottage, a little poor cottage, that is on the property of a castle. So you can see the castle from the cottage, or maybe you can. I'm sure it's both, vice versa. You can see the cottage from the castle, and so you have this little poor abode, but it's enchanted. Nature has really done a number on it. It's beautiful there. You've got flowers growing, you have sweet birds singing, and meanwhile, the castle in comparison is haunted and dreary and frowned down upon the little hovel. So, in this little hovel, In this little cottage, there lived a dame. So let's take a look at that. The lord of the castle, a proud and surly ruler, oft heard the low dwelling with sweet music ring. For the old dame that lived in the little hut cheerily would sit at her wheel and would merrily sing. When with the revels the castle's great hall was resounding, the old dame was sleeping, not dreaming of fear. And when over the mountains the huntsmen were bounding, she would open her lattice, their clamors to hear. To the merry toned horn she would dance on the threshold, and louder repeat her old song. And when winter its mantle of frost was displaying, she caroled, undaunted, the bare woods among. She would gather dry fern, ever happy and singing, with her cake of brown bread and her jug of brown beer, and would smile when she heard the great castle bell ringing, inviting the proud to their prodigal cheer. Thus she lived, ever patient and ever contented, till envy the lord of the castle possessed. So here we get this little lady, old lady. She's living in this little poor, rundown cottage, which we said is not poor to her. It's actually an enchanted little place. It's a beautiful little place, and nature has smiled upon her. And she's happy, right? She's content. She didn't have a lot, but she didn't seem to mind. Instead, she spends her days happily working at her spinning wheel and singing all day long. She lived in no fear of the outside world or the elements of nature. She was ever patient and ever contented with the life that she lived there. She was never jealous or resentful of the comings and goings at the castle, the parties, the hunts that took place. Um, and so she lived in this way, very content with her situation. However, over in the castle, we have a surly old castle lord, right? And he hears her singing. So thus she lived, ever patient and ever contented, till envy the lord of the castle possessed. For he hated that poverty should be so cheerful, while care could the favorites of fortune molest. He sent his bold yeoman with threats to prevent her, and still she would carol her sweet roundelay. At last, an old steward, relentless, he sent her, who bore her all trembling to prison away. So this lord in the castle, this proud, surly lord, would often hear her singing, and it pissed him off essentially that she was always so cheerful. He had everything that he could possibly want, but he didn't live without care. Whether that means, he was sad or lonely, depressed, we're not really told, but we do know that he was envious of the poor old woman, and it made him mad that she had so little and was so happy and content. To him, what right did she have to be happy? It was unfathomable for him to imagine that she could be so content with the hand that fate and fortune had dealt her. So he sends some muscle, his bold yeoman, to hush her up. She didn't even check up, though. She continued to sing. It says, and still she would carol her sweet roundelay. And then, so ultimately, since she wasn't even threatened by his bold yeoman. He had her thrown into prison. He sent a steward to collect her and throw her into prison. And let's go from there. So 3 weeks did she languish, then died broken hearted. Poor dame, how the death bell did mournfully sound, and along the green path 6 young bachelors bore her and laid her forever beneath the cold ground. And the primroses pale mid the long grass were growing, the bright dews of twilight bespangled her grave, and morn heard the breezes of summer soft blowing to bid the fresh florets in sympathy wave. So she dies. She dies there in prison. She suffers in the conditions of the prison, and ultimately she died broken hearted because she was taken away from her enchanted little cottage. She was buried, And nature, just as it did while she was living around her poor cottage, enchanted the very place where she lay with bright dews of twilight, and flowers, fresh florets that bespangled her grave. And you got these soft summer breezes that are blowing all around, and so you've got, all that happening. So just as it was when she was alive, nature shows up and shows out, and does the same thing for her grave. So the lord of the castle, from that fatal moment when poor singing Mary was laid in her grave, each night was surrounded by screech owls appalling, which o'er the black turrets their pinions would wave. On the ramparts that frowned on the river swift flowing, they hovered, still hooting a terrible song. When his windows would rattle, the winter blast blowing, they would shriek like a ghost the dark alleys among. Sorry, I had the hiccups. Wherever he wandered, they followed him, crying. At dawnlight, at eve, still they haunted his way. When the moon shone across the wide common, they hooted, nor quitted his path till the blazing of day. His bones began wasting, his flesh was decaying, and he hung his proud head, and he perished with shame. And the tomb of rich marble, no soft tear displaying, o'ershadows the grave of the poor singing dame. So here we have this surly lord that lived in the castle, who couldn't understand why she was so happy, and he takes that away from her. And then he finds himself at the receiving end of an angry mother nature, right? She attacks him, and nature attacks him. Every night he deals with screeching owls, which, is commonly considered a portent of death or an omen of death, hooting a terrible song while the winter wind is rattling his windows, shrieking like a ghost. He finds himself haunted night and day without cease, until his bones began wasting, his flesh decaying, and he perished with shame. So he finds himself haunted night and day without cease until he begins to waste and wither away. And he ultimately dies. And he's buried without fanfare. There's nobody cries over his grave. There are no bells. There's no sound. He's buried and in a tomb of rich marble. Nobody's crying over him, and his marble tomb overlooks, and it's that overlooks, yes, but it's more important that it overshadows the grave of the poor singing dame. So, as oppressive as he was kind of in life, he is also oppressive to her in death. Robinson seems to be reminding us that it's not necessarily wealth, power, and status that brings us joy. It kind of brings to my head the story of Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson, the poem about Richard Cory, who had everything and everybody looked upon him, and wished they could be him. And he goes home one night, here he is, he's got everything. He looks down at the people on the pavement, or rather they're looking up to him, and wanting to be like him. And he goes home, and he puts a bullet in his head, because he doesn't have everything. He might have everything, um, like that he wants, but not everything possibly that he needs, or things that make him happy. And so our level of happiness, she seems to be suggesting, is really dependent upon our perspective and our view of life. The dame didn't have a lot, but she was contented with the life that she lived, and lived happily and cheerily, and nature responded to that, which is a construct of that romantic period ideal of the restorative powers of nature, the significant powers of nature, here in the poor singing dame.